At about 2:30 in the morning on the 26th of March, 1872, the ground under the Owens Valley tore open and the eastern wall of the Sierra Nevada moved. In the little town of Lone Pine, almost every adobe house collapsed within a few seconds. 27 people died that night in a settlement of barely 300 souls. They were buried together in one long trench north of the town because there was no time and very little timber to do anything more careful. And when the sun finally rose over the valley floor, the people who were left alive walked out and saw something along the base of the mountains that no one has ever fully explained away. The earth had lifted itself into a line of clean, level steps. Ranchers described a fresh wall of rock running for miles, in places 2 men high, as though a blade had been drawn along the foot of the range and the whole valley on one side had been dropped like a floor. Cattle that had been grazing on flat ground the evening before were now standing below a ledge they could not climb. A lake appeared where there had been dry sink the day before. And the story that spread, quietly at first. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Was not the story the geologists wanted told. The people who lived there said the mountain had opened a staircase. That fresh wall had a name almost before the dust settled. Geologists would later map it as the Lone Pine Fault Scarp, a break in the surface that in places had thrown one side up 6 or 7 feet in a single motion and shoved it sideways as well. South of town, a shallow basin dropped along the fault and filled with water that is still there, a body now called Diaz Lake that simply was not on any map the week before. A lake that did not exist on a Monday was a permanent feature by the weekend, created not by rain but by the ground itself sagging along a line. If a fault can conjure a lake overnight, the people who stood there and watched it happen were not foolish to wonder what else the ground could do in a few seconds. This is the eastern Sierra Nevada, in California, and it holds one of the strangest records on the continent. Not because of what happened in 1872 alone, but because of the pattern. Every major canyon that drains this range ends, near its mouth, in a set of benches and terraces so regular that early travelers kept reaching for the same word: steps. And the official history of this place, the one written by the men who named these peaks and drew these maps, has spent 150 years insisting that water and ice made those steps, 1 grain at a time, over millions of years. The people who dug the graves in Lone Pine were not so sure. This is the story of what split the Sierra, who profited from the answer, and why the real reset in this valley was never the earthquake at all. To understand why a line of steps in the desert should matter to anyone, you have to understand what the Eastern Sierra actually is. This is not a gentle mountain range. On its western side it rises slowly out of the California foothills over 50 or 60 miles, but on its eastern side, the side that looks down onto the Owens Valley, it does something almost violent. It climbs more than 10,000 feet in a horizontal distance of only a few miles. Mount Whitney, the highest point in the lower 48 states, stands just over 14,000 feet, and the valley floor beneath it sits at about 4,000. You can see the summit and the sagebrush in the same glance. There is no other wall quite like it in the country. The accepted explanation for that wall is a tilted block. Geologists describe the whole Sierra Nevada as a single enormous slab of granite that has been slowly rotated, lifted high along its eastern edge, and hinged down along the west, riding up on a series of faults over the last few million years. The steep eastern face, in this telling, is the raw edge of that block, and every earthquake like the one in 1872 is another small jerk upward. The steps at the canyon mouths are called fault scarps, the exposed faces where the ground on one side has risen relative to the other. Give it enough earthquakes, they say, and you get a staircase for free. That is a real theory, and it is supported by real measurements, and I am going to give it a fair hearing all the way through, because it deserves one. But hold on to the shape of the claim. The official story is that the most abrupt mountain front in America was built entirely by accident, one nudge at a time, and that the tidiness of the result means nothing at all. The quake itself is well documented for its age. It struck along what is now called the Owens Valley Fault Zone, and modern estimates put its magnitude somewhere between 7.4 and 7.9, which would place it among the 3 largest earthquakes in California history, in the same class as the Great San Francisco Quake of 1906. In some places, the ground shifted sideways by as much as 20 feet and lifted vertically by 6 or 7. John Muir, who was in Yosemite Valley more than 100 miles to the north, was thrown out of bed and ran into the moonlight, expecting the cliffs to come down. He watched a rockfall he called Eagle Rock peel off the valley wall in a torrent of sparks and dust, and instead of terror he felt something close to joy. He shouted, by his own account, a greeting to the noble earthquake, and spent the following days convinced he had just watched the mountains being actively built in front of him. That reaction matters more than it looks, because Muir was standing in the middle of a fight about exactly this question, and the fight was about steps. The most powerful geologist in California at the time was Josiah Whitney, head of the California Geological Survey, the man whose survey named Mount Whitney after him. Whitney looked at Yosemite Valley, at its flat floor and its sheer vertical walls, and concluded that no slow process could have made it. His theory was catastrophic. He argued that the bottom of the valley had simply dropped out, that the floor had fallen away during some ancient convulsion of the earth and left the walls standing. To Whitney, Yosemite was not carved. It was collapsed. The ground had opened and a block had sunk. Muir, a self-taught wanderer with no university standing, said the opposite. He said ice did it. He traced polished granite and scattered boulders and old moraines, and argued that glaciers had ground the valley into its shape over an immense span of time. The professional establishment sided with Whitney and openly mocked Muir as an ignorant shepherd. History, on the glaciation question, has mostly sided with Muir. In 1930, the government geologist Francois Matthes published the detailed glacial study that made Muir's ice the textbook answer. But notice what both men agreed on. Both of them looked at the same valley and saw something that could not be explained by a quiet river doing ordinary work. One said the floor collapsed. One said a glacier quarried it. Neither said it looked natural in the gentle sense. They only disagreed about which violent process to credit. And the revisionist reading of the Sierra lives precisely in that gap, in the fact that the 2 most serious observers of this landscape both reached for catastrophe. Go up into Yosemite today and you will find a feature the park itself calls the Giant Staircase. The Merced River drops down it in 2 great leaps, Vernal Fall and then Nevada Fall, each one plunging off the lip of a broad granite tread onto the next level below. It is one of the most photographed sequences in the range, and it is, quite literally, a staircase of stone hundreds of feet tall. The mainstream account of it is careful and specific. Granite, it says, is cut by natural fracture planes called joints, which tend to run in flat sheets and straight vertical walls. When a glacier grinds down a canyon, it does not scratch evenly. It plucks. It freezes onto blocks of granite along those joints and rips them out bodily, quarrying the rock in rectangular chunks and leaving behind flat treads and steep rises. Where the jointing is spaced widely, you get a tall step. Where the rock is more massive, you get a long, flat bench, a staircase, in other words, without a mason. I want to be honest about how good that explanation is. It predicts the right shapes. It matches the fracture patterns you can measure in the field. It is not a desperate story. If you had never heard anyone suggest otherwise, you would find it completely convincing, and most geologists do. The plucking of jointed granite by moving ice is textbook, and it genuinely produces steps. The revisionist reading does not deny the joints. It asks a different and slightly uncomfortable question. Why is the jointing itself so regular? Why does a supposedly random network of cracks in cooling rock so often produce rises of similar height and treads of similar width, canyon after canyon, as though the range were built in courses like a wall and the ice merely swept the dust off a finished set of stairs? That is not proof of anything. It is a question about tidiness, and tidiness, in this landscape, keeps showing up. Because it is not only Yosemite. Run north to south along the range and the same grammar repeats. The canyons hang. A side valley will end abruptly high on the wall of a main valley, its floor cut off in mid-air hundreds of feet above the floor below, so that its stream has to leap out into space. Geologists call these hanging valleys and explain them, again reasonably, as the work of a large glacier cutting deeper than its smaller tributaries. But stand at the mouth of one and the effect is architectural. It looks like a doorway set into an upper story, a level that was meant to connect to something and now opens onto air. String enough of these together, the hanging valleys, the plucked treads, the fault benches at the canyon mouths, and the eastern Sierra starts to read less like a mountain range and more like the ruined face of a structure, with its lower floors buried and its stairs half swept clean. And the vocabulary gives the game away. Read the old survey notes and the early travel accounts and you find the same words again and again: benches, terraces, treads, courses, ramparts, the language of masonry pressed into service to describe supposedly random stone. People do not describe a heap of erosion debris as a flight of stairs unless the thing in front of them is genuinely stair-shaped. The mainstream would say the human eye simply loves to find order and imposes it on chaos. Maybe so, but the eye that named these features usually belonged to a trained surveyor who was paid to be precise about exactly this kind of thing, a man whose whole profession depended on not mistaking a natural slope for a built one. I am describing how it looks. I am not yet telling you what it is. Keep those two things separate in your head, because the people who came into this valley with money understood the difference perfectly, and they used it. Here is the part the geology books leave out. Long before any surveyor named a peak, the Owens Valley was already an engineered landscape. The Paiute people who lived here, who call themselves the Numu, had built one of the most sophisticated irrigation systems anywhere north of Mexico without any of the trappings that Europeans recognized as civilization. They dammed the creeks coming off those stepped canyons and ran ditches for miles across the valley floor, some of them 4 feet wide and reaching back a mile or more into the mountains to water wild crops of seed and tuber. They managed the flow with brush dams and moved it from field to field by season. They had, in effect, plumbed the runoff of the entire range by hand, generations before anyone from Los Angeles had heard the valley's name. That fact is the hinge of this whole story, so sit with it. The first people to price the water coming off these mysterious steps were not the Americans. The Numu had already turned the canyon runoff into a working economy, and what happened to them is the template for everything that followed. In the winter of 1862 and into 1863, after miners and cattlemen moved in and the two economies collided over the same water and the same grass, the United States Army and local volunteers waged what is politely called the Owens Valley Indian War. It ended, as these things ended, with a forced march. In July of 1863, around 1,000 Numu were driven south out of their valley to a reservation at Fort Tejon, more than 200 miles away over the mountains. Many died on the road. Many later slipped back to the valley to find their ditches taken over by settlers who used the very same channels to water the very same fields. The infrastructure did not disappear. It changed hands. The people who built the waterworks were removed, and the waterworks kept running for somebody else. Remember that sequence, because you are going to see it happen twice more. Someone builds or reveals a system. Someone else decides who owns it. And the official record is written by the second group. 9 years before the earthquake, the same year as that forced march, prospectors found silver in the Inyo Mountains on the far side of the valley, at a place they called Cerro Gordo, the Fat Hill. What came out of that hill over the next 2 decades helped build a dusty cow town on the coast into a city. Cerro Gordo, silver and lead were hauled down to Owens Lake, which in those days was a real lake, wide and blue and deep enough to sail, and loaded onto a steamer called the Bessie Brady that ran the bullion across the water to shorten the freight road. From the far shore, mule teams dragged it south. The old line in Los Angeles was that Cerro Gordo was the mine that built the city. Its silver paid for brick blocks and waterworks and wharves down on the coast, while the Owens Valley itself stayed poor. North of there, other men were pulling gold out of the hills at Bodie, a camp so violent and so remote that a little girl whose family was moving there supposedly wrote in her diary a line that became famous: "Goodbye, God, I am going to Bodie." And east over the state line, the Comstock lode under Virginia City in Nevada was throwing off the silver fortunes that would fund banks and railroads and mansions in San Francisco. This whole region, the entire eastern spine of California and the edge of Nevada, was a machine for turning rock into money, and the men who ran that machine needed exactly one thing from the geologists. They needed to know what the ground was worth. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Which brings us back to the surveys, and to why the answer to the staircase question was never going to be a neutral one. Think about who actually decided what these mountains were. The Whitney Survey, the California Geological Survey, was not a philosophy club. It was a state-funded effort whose entire purpose was to inventory the mineral wealth of California, to tell the government and the investors where the value was. Clarence King, who worked under Whitney and William Brewer on that survey and later became the first director of the National Geological Survey, understood better than almost anyone that a geological map is a financial document. It tells you where to dig and where not to bother. When such a survey looks at a strange formation and rules it natural, ordinary, the slow product of erosion, that ruling has a price attached. Natural ground with no ore is worthless ground. It can be crossed off, fenced, taken cheaply, and forgotten. The moment you call something a plain fault scarp, you have also called it nobody's work and nobody's claim. So, when the revisionist looks at the official Sierra and asks why every anomaly was so quickly filed under ordinary erosion, there is at least a coherent motive in the room. The men doing the filing were paid to price the land, and the cheapest price you can put on a mysterious staircase is to declare that no one built it. I am not telling you they were lying. I am telling you that the incentive ran in one direction only, and it is worth knowing that before you accept the verdict. But the mining boom is not the reset this valley is remembered for. The reset came from the water, and it came from the south, and it is one of the most brazen transfers of wealth in American history. By the early 1900s, Los Angeles had outgrown its own river. A former ditch tender turned self-taught engineer named William Mulholland ran the city water department, and he and a small circle of insiders looked north at the Owens Valley and saw a solution and an opportunity in the same instant. The Owens River, fed by the snowmelt pouring down every one of those stepped canyons, carried more clean water than the whole city could drink. So agents working quietly for Los Angeles, some of them posing as ranchers and irrigation men, began buying up land and the water rights attached to it, parcel by parcel, before the valley understood what was being assembled. A federal reclamation project that valley farmers had been promised, one that would have watered their own fields, was quietly killed to clear the way. Then between 1908 and 1913, the city built the Los Angeles Aqueduct, more than 200 miles of channel and tunnel and pipe, to carry the Owens River across the desert to the San Fernando Valley entirely by gravity, without a single pump. When the water first came roaring down the final cascade into the city on a November day in 1913, Mulholland turned to the crowd and gave the shortest dedication speech in the history of public works. He gestured at the water and said, "There it is, take it." 5 words. The valley's river now belonged to a city its people could not even see, and the water did not simply flow to thirsty households. Before the aqueduct was even finished, a syndicate of well-connected Los Angeles men quietly bought up cheap, dry farmland in the San Fernando Valley, land that was close to worthless without irrigation. They knew what the public did not, that the Owens River was coming, and that it would be routed to spill out precisely there. When the water arrived, that cheap desert land became some of the most valuable real estate in the state almost overnight, and the men who had bought it early made fortunes on the difference. The Owens Valley was drained, the San Fernando Valley was watered, and a handful of insiders collected the spread between the two. The consequences arrived quickly, and they were total. Owens Lake, that wide blue body of water the Bessie Brady had crossed with silver a generation earlier, began to shrink as its inflow was diverted south. Within about a dozen years it was essentially gone, a flat white pan of alkali dust where a lake had been. The farms went dry. The valley economy, which had survived the removal of the Paiute and the collapse of the mines, could not survive the removal of the water. In the 1920s, the ranchers who were left fought back in the only way that got attention. In 1924, a group of them seized the Alabama Gates, a spillway on the aqueduct, and over the following years dynamited sections of the pipeline again and again in what the newspapers called the California Water Wars. They opened the gates and let the stolen river spill back onto the desert, and for a few days they held the structure like a captured fort while sympathetic townspeople brought them food and music. It changed nothing in the end. The city had the deeds and the courts and the capital, and the valley had gravel. The dynamiting stopped. The water kept going south. Here is where the reset closes its circle, in a way almost too neat to believe. That dry lake bed, Owens Lake, became the single largest source of dust pollution in the entire United States. When the wind came down off those same canyons, it lifted the exposed alkali into choking storms of fine particulate, the kind small enough to lodge deep in human lungs, the kind regulators classify as PM10. For decades, the valley that had been drained to build a city was also poisoned by the drying it caused. In the end, Los Angeles was ordered to fix it, and the mitigation, the shallow flooding and gravel and managed vegetation spread across the lake bed to hold the dust down, has cost well over $1 billion and still runs today. The city spent a fortune putting a thin skin of water back onto the lake it had emptied, not to give it back, but to keep it from blowing away. Sit with the arithmetic of that. They took the water for almost nothing. They spent more than $1 billion a century later to manage the dust that the taking created. The valley got neither the river nor the money. It got the bill, and it got it in the air its children breathed. There is one more turn, and it is the one that gives the whole affair its bitter shine. Just west of Lone Pine, right in front of that stepped mountain wall, sits a jumble of rounded golden boulders called the Alabama Hills. From the 1920s onward, Hollywood discovered that this spot could stand in for almost any rugged country on Earth. Hundreds of westerns were shot among those rocks, with the snow-topped Sierra as a backdrop, so that the same landscape the city had emptied of water was sold a second time as an image, as scenery, as the mythic frontier that American audiences paid to watch. The valley was sold twice, once for the water in its river and once for the picture of its mountains. The people who actually lived there owned neither transaction. That is the reset. Not a night in 1872 when the ground jumped and made a staircase. A slow, legal, engineered draining of a place by people who never lived in it, recorded in ledgers and deeds and dedication speeches, while the geologists in the room certified the scenery as natural and therefore free for the taking. So what about the steps? With all of that in view, what do we actually make of the staircases at the canyon mouths and of the fresh one that rose out of the dark in 1872? The mainstream answer, laid out fairly, has three parts, and they fit together well. First, the eastern Sierra is the lifted edge of a tilted fault block, and every large earthquake on the Owens Valley Fault ratchets it a little higher, leaving fresh scarps at the surface exactly like the one Lone Pine woke up to. Second, during the ice ages, glaciers filled these canyons and quarried the jointed granite into treads and risers by plucking, producing the giant staircases and the hanging valleys with no design involved. Third, some of the terracing at the range front is the old shoreline of vanished Ice Age lakes, flat benches left behind as the water dropped, fault, ice, and lake. Three ordinary processes, each well understood, each leaving steps. That is a strong hand, and an honest account has to say so plainly. The revisionist does not need to overturn any of that to keep the question alive. The question is only this: is that the whole of it? Because there is a fourth thing under this valley that the ordinary story tends to mention last, and it is the strangest of all. North of Bishop, at the top of the Owens Valley, the ground is not merely faulted, it is a caldera. Long Valley Caldera is the scar of a volcanic eruption so large it is hard to picture, an event around 760,000 years ago that emptied a magma chamber and blasted out hundreds of cubic miles of ash. So much that the fallout, now called the Bishop Tuff, is found as far away as Nebraska. When the chamber emptied, the roof over it collapsed straight down, dropping a block of the Earth's surface into the hole and leaving an oval basin about 10 miles across ringed by walls. Here the official science itself, with no revisionist prompting at all, describes the landscape as a floor that fell in. It is Whitney's old theory of Yosemite, rejected there, but literally true a few miles up the same valley. The ground here really did drop out, and it is not finished. The center of that caldera has been slowly rising again, a resurgent dome pushed up from below. In 1980, a swarm of earthquakes, including 4 of magnitude 6 in a single day, shook the town of Mammoth Lakes, and the ground measurably bulged. When the Geological Survey issued a hazard notice warning that the volcano was restless, property values in the resort town collapsed almost overnight, and the residents were furious, not at the volcano, but at the geologists whose words had priced their homes. On the flank of Mammoth Mountain, carbon dioxide seeping up from the magma below has killed whole stands of trees, leaving grey patches of dead forest where the gas pools in the soil. Nearby, the Mono and Inyo craters mark a line of eruptions so recent that some are only a few hundred years old, younger than the printing press. And Long Valley closes the economic loop as tightly as the water did. When the Geological Survey raised its alert in the early 1980s, it was doing the same thing the Whitney Survey had done a century before, putting a value on the ground by naming what it was. Only this time the naming ran the other way. A word from the government that the volcano might wake did not make the land worthless because it lacked ore. It made the land worthless because it might one day explode. Homeowners in Mammoth Lakes watched their equity evaporate on the strength of a hazard map, and they fought the geologists in packed public meetings the way the Owens Valley ranchers had once fought the aqueduct. Same mountains, same lesson. Whoever gets to describe the ground gets to set its price, and everyone who merely lives on it is left at the mercy of the description. Put that together with everything else, and the Eastern Sierra stops being a quiet ruin and becomes something still moving. A tilted block grinding upward in 7.5 magnitude jerks. A chain of canyons cut into courses like masonry. A collapsed floor at the valley's head that even the textbooks admit fell in one piece. And a resurgent dome breathing carbon dioxide through dead trees while it lifts back toward the sky. The revisionist looks at that and says the reveal is ongoing, that the ground keeps opening its stairs and its rooms because the burial was never quite complete. The geologist looks at the same evidence and says fault, ice, lake, and caldera, 4 natural clocks, no architect required. I have laid both out as fairly as I can, and I am not going to pretend the honest science is weak, because it is not. The plucking of jointed granite makes steps, tilted fault blocks make scarps, calderas collapse and later resurge. Every piece of the ordinary explanation is real and measured and reproducible. But I will leave you with the one thing that does not sit quite flat, the thing the people of Lone Pine knew in their bodies on that cold March morning while they dug the trench for their dead. The most valuable question you can ask about any landscape is not how it formed, it is who gets to say. Whitney said collapse and was overruled. Muir said ice and was vindicated. The Numu said the water was theirs and were marched to Fort Tejon. The valley said the river was its own, and Mulholland said, there it is, take it. In every case the ground itself stayed silent, and the naming went to whoever held the survey, the deed, and the capital. The steps in the canyons may be nothing more than fractured granite swept clean by ice. Or they may be the exposed courses of something older that no ledger was ever willing to price, because to price it honestly would be to admit it was built. The 1872 Quake was not the only one. It will not be the last. And each time the ground splits open a little further, the same quiet contest begins again over who owns what the earthquake showed. Make of that what you will.